Hi, and the Brexit video, we've had a few interesting things cropping up in the news in the last week from the point of view of the Conservatives under Prime Minister Theresa May, as well as Labour under Jeremy Corbyn. Worth talking about. One thing I want to start with, of course, on the last, Brexit video type thing, there were an awful lot of comments, an awful lot of people boo-hooing, ironically as Brexiteers. I don't know what they've got to cry about, but anyway. But there's one comment, where there is an intelligent comment made, I at least like to try and reply if I can. It says, "Oh dear, when will you hardline Remainers play clips of politicians? You need to show the whole segment, not just cut it off when they say, nobody said we would leave the single market, but go on to say that we would have a trade under a free deal." Now, the first thing is this. So what I did is I played clips of leading Brexiteers saying that we are not going to leave the single market, that they don't intend us to leave the single market. As if saying anything straight after it is going to change anything. But for me to play the whole clip, you're talking about me playing 6 hours of clips before I say anything. I don't think that's really sensible. But the other thing is we'll add this one on. So, we won't leave the single market. We will trade under a free deal. And this is the problem. A lot of people just think that means, okay, we get the free trade deal and there's no strings attached or anything like that. The way the way any trade works, and this is where people just don't understand basics. The way any trade deal works, each country has its own standards for goods. Of course, we have to have our own standards for goods to make sure they're not harmful to our population. And different countries agree or disagree on what those are. For example, there's been a lot of talk about a new trade deal rather than the United States. And we know that the United States want to ship over some things that we don't consider all that safe. The hormone-injected beef, that sort of thing. Chlorine-washed chicken. But it goes the other way. There are some things that Europe can't trade to America because it doesn't think they're safe. We can't trade haggis to America. So, expat Scots living in North America on Burns night don't get a haggis. I don't know whether they can make their own. I don't know why it has to be imported, but for whatever reason. Kinder eggs, even, they can't go over there because it's chocolate intended for kids with plastic inside of it. So America doesn't consider that safe. So it all works like this. So you have to have certain standards before you can trade things. So free trade sort of removes that. But the way we solve it in the EU is all the countries agree to have the same standards. Because a lot of people keep talking about, we need to leave the EU because, we don't want our laws determined in Brussels. Things like that. Our laws are not determined in Brussels. If our laws were determined in Brussels, every country in the EU would have the same laws. Well, we don't. If every country in the EU had our laws determined in Brussels, why would we need Parliament? We have Parliament. That's what they do. They legislate. We don't have the same laws. There are some laws that we sort of say we need as common standards. Those are laws regarding goods and services, the human rights, a set of human rights, which we came up with, by the way. That was 100% British legislators and lawyers coming up with those. And that's pretty much it. So... And that would be the same. See, the other countries of the EU would love it if we had this, the free deal. It's absolutely marvellous. All we have to do is agree that as a result of this, there needs to be set standards that are all agreed. Now, the thing is, of course, at the moment in the EU, we get a say in what those standards are. By leaving it, we remove those standards. Nigel Farage, for example, kept talking about Norway. Oh, we should be like Norway. Well, that's exactly what Norway do. Norway accept those standards. They get no say in it because they're not a member of the EU. But they accept them. They agree to them. Simple as that. All the things that many of these Brexiteers saying we don't want to have these same laws as these other countries are the ones that are absolutely essential in order to get a trade deal. And that applies if we make individual trade agreements with every other country. We still have to agree certain standards. If we make a trade deal with India, India will say, okay, these goods you make don't meet our standards, so you can't trade them across here. And then we say in return, well, those goods that you make don't meet our standards, you can't trade them across here, and so on. And of course, inevitably, and this is the fear, in order for anyone, whoever's in charge, Theresa May, Boris the Buffoon Johnson, or anyone else like that, to come up with a trade deal, they'll be desperate to make a trade deal, and they will inevitably make one that's bad for Britain. And the way they will do it is by, we will have to accept whatever conditions the other country wants, but we will basically water down our own. So, for example, with the America thing, we don't produce Kinder Egg, we produce haggis. We'll still never be able to export haggis to America, but we'll probably have to accept the hormone-injected beef and the chlorine-washed chicken and stuff like that that's considered acceptable in America, but not over here. That'll all change. We'll just say, well, we'll have no standards at all, just so that we can trade. And I'm not saying any of that. I mean, obviously, if it's fine in America, not here, which government's got it right? Are we being overprotective? Are they being underprotective of their own citizenry? Who knows? I don't know. I don't know the science on how harmful either of those two things are. But inevitably what it means is we are going to be acting from a position of having to reduce those. So that's one go. And also when it says, Brexit only works if we leave all aspects of the EU. If you have an argument, please don't lie. I didn't lie. I played the clip specifically so people could see that I wasn't lying. At the end of the day, when those people say, we aren't going to leave the single market, I don't want us to leave the single market. Leaving the single market would be madness. And then the very next day, they say we must leave the single market. It ain't me that's lying. Anyway. Oh, and on to the other thing. It says, I do hope your next video will be on the financial backing of... Well, by the time they've written this comment, there's already been several next videos, so you can see it isn't. The financial backing of Mr. Soros, who was happy to bring Britain to its knees and now has his money, blah, 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 blah. It doesn't matter which side of the argument a very wealthy businessman or woman is, okay? Brexit, Remainer. Doesn't matter. They're all acting from their own self-interest. All right? And that actually is quite telling. It's actually quite... I mean, what I could do a video on is all the leading Brexiteers, the very wealthy Brexiteers, who have now moved their money into the EU. As in, away from Britain, because we're still in the EU. Right? They've moved their business dealings and their money out of Britain. Including Nigel Farage. In fact, he's going to go off and live in the EU. He's not going to be living in Britain. When we leave, that was his plan. So, but there are other ones on the Remain side as well. And you don't follow what a wealthy business person does, because the way they became a wealthy business person was by doing what was necessary to increase their wealth, whichever side they're on. But it is interesting to note that of all the business leaders in the country, the vast majority wanted us to remain. So if you're trying to think to yourself, but what's good for business is good for the rest of us because they supply us with jobs. Well, the vast majority of business leaders wanted to remain in the EU. So either way you look at it, there isn't really a lot of sensible support for leaving. But anyway, on to what's actually happening now. So, in terms of referendum, well, people keep talking about a second referendum. So I don't believe it will happen. But also, a lot of people keep assuming that what's meant by a second referendum is a copy of the first referendum. And then the usual argument comes out from, Brexiteers, that would be a betrayal of democracy and things like this. And actually, no, it wouldn't. Not that I'm saying that we will or even should have another referendum. Well, I think we should. But it wouldn't, because to say that having another referendum would be a betrayal of democracy is to say, why do we even have general elections? General elections are a betrayal of democracy. After all, if you elect a particular MP, Nick Dakin is my local MP, so he was voted into Parliament. Well, isn't having a general election a few years later a betrayal of democracy? Because people already voted him in. Why are we making people vote him in again? Why don't we just wait for him to retire or to die before we vote someone else in? So it's an absolute nonsense. We get used to the fact that every few years we have another vote just to check that people are still happy with the way things are. And in Brexit's case, this is inevitably the way it is, because it doesn't matter whether you're a Brexit or a Remainer. The situation we are in right now, which is a couple of months away from crunch time, it's not just the fact that we're leaving in March. We can't decide things by March. We've got to decide things by November. Because whatever is decided, individual member states of the EU have to have their say. Because again, this is another thing that's shocking people who are on the Brexit side of it. individual member states do get their own say. Always. They're the bosses of the EU. And that was including us until like in 6 months' time. So they all have to have their own say. And it takes several months for that to happen. And if any of them say no to it, it's all sunk. So, you know, something's got to happen by basically in November. And on that point as well, but yeah, so before I go on to that point, sorry, just finish the first one. So it's not a betrayal of democracy, because no matter where you were, no one, if you were to ask them the day after the referendum when the result came in, Brexit or Remainer, what do you envisage to be the situation in November 2018? Not one of them would have said, oh, well, nothing will have been agreed at all. Not one of them. Doesn't matter how much on one side or the other argument you were. Not even me, as a Remainer, thought that we would be in this much mess. So to suggest that it would be betrayal of democracy to have another referendum would be laughable. But of course, it doesn't have to be another referendum. Because the first referendum was a stupid question anyway. It was just, do you want to be in the EU or not? Well, that doesn't really, you know, there was no, if you don't want to be in the EU, what sort of situation do you want here? But it doesn't matter about that. So you could ask a more sensible one. You could ask a referendum that doesn't give any option for stay in the EU as such. It could be, do you want, you know, do you support this Chequers deal if the EU accepts it? Or do you actually want, because at the moment May's, you know, pushing this particular deal, which a lot of Brexiteers don't like. A lot of, well, no one really likes it apart from Theresa May. Not even convinced she likes it. She just thinks it's a compromise, that's all. But the problem is this is so divisive. I don't think there is such a thing as a compromise, to be fair to her. But you could have a referendum that says, how desperately do you want this? Do you want us to have no deal? Do you because some people actively want us to have no deal as if it's a good thing. And it's you know, because there was that saying, wasn't there? No deal is better than a bad deal. But it's a bit of a silly play with words, really, because no deal is the worst deal imaginable. A better saying would have been, no Brexit is better than a bad Brexit. But anyway. That's my view on that one. So in terms of what's really happening, so with the government at the moment, which remember has a very slender lead, and this is actually going to be quite important. The situation has been throughout the Brexit process that in effect we've had two leaders, Jeremy Corbyn of the leader of the opposition, Theresa May as the Prime Minister, in a very strange position. Actually, they've both been in a very strange position. Theresa May did not support Brexit, but she's now found herself at the head of a party which is very, very split, but the noisiest people, the most influential people are supporting Brexit. Whereas Jeremy Corbyn is leader of a party that largely does not support Brexit, is very anti-Brexit, but he himself is very pro-Brexit. Not openly pro-Brexit, because he did sort of follow the party line during the campaign, and he didn't do a very good job of it, and he was like, had to be pushed into saying anything. You know, it was very much like, go on, Jeremy, you've got to speak against Brexit. And he went out in front of the camera and went, yeah, don't vote for Brexit. Right, I'm done. Because he sort of is a Brexiteer himself. He absolutely would have voted for him. Obviously, secret ballot. He absolutely would have voted to leave, and Theresa May absolutely would have voted to remain. So they find themselves in these weird positions where Jeremy Corbyn is having to sort of say, well, he sort of gets a free card because he gets to say, well, we're not going to go against the referendum result, but, you know, and Theresa May has to now sort of say, whenever she's asked, how would you vote now? She has to say, I'm not going to say, but ultimately we're going to deliver Brexit and I'm going to squash any attempts at another referendum. But both of them are under a certain amount of pressure in different ways. I don't think Jeremy Corbyn's leadership is under pressure, even though, here's the thing with Jeremy Corbyn. He has a lot of support amongst Labour supporters, ordinary people, who actually think he's a decent man. And I think he has decent politics, but I don't believe he's a decent man. But I've talked about that before. But he has no support in the parliamentary party. And that should always be a bit of a warning sign, I feel. because the people like myself in the country, we don't really know Jeremy Corbyn properly. But when you've got people in the parliamentary Labour Party, the people who do know him, his colleagues who see him every day, and they talk about bullying, and when you see some of these, a lot of this emerging, I mean, when you see a situation where the people in the shadow cabinet, you're very, very close to him, some of them are perfectly competent people, but quite a lot of them are not. So the only reason they're in those positions is, quite frankly, because, well, they support him politically. That just shows you how few allies he has in Parliament. And it's an untenable situation for a potential Prime Minister to be in. But there is a Labour Party conference coming up, and there's a very, very strong push for Labour to officially support another referendum. Now, the interesting thing is, there would always have been a lot of support in the Labour Party and in the Parliamentary Party, as well as in the core support, for another referendum. Even though I also accept there are a significant number of Labour voters who are still in favour of Brexit, but in the Labour Party, that is definitely a minority. In the Tory Party, I think it's more split. But it's quite tricky, because for it to be adopted as official Labour policy, a lot of the people who are pushing for it, let's face it, like myself, are very anti-Corbyn. Now, I'm not anti-Corbyn in the sense that I think he should step down or be ousted, which sounds weird. The reason for that is I just don't see... I think, to be fair, when the leadership election that elected Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party happened, I didn't really see any obvious candidates to be leader of the Labour Party. I just don't think at the moment they've got someone who can really win elections. You know, if Labour find themselves in government in any time soon, I think it'll be because the Conservative Party self-destruct rather than Labour actively win it. I think those days, I mean, you know, say what you like about Tony Blair, and there was certainly an awful lot of things he did that I was appalled at. He knew how to win elections, and he won elections. You know, it wasn't that the opposition lost them, he won them. Anyway. So it's quite tricky that a lot of the people who'd be supporting this also support the removal of Jeremy Corbyn, which is obviously going to make Jeremy Corbyn himself very wary of them. So there's been a bit of a release gone out, basically saying to people who are trying to push for this, don't tie it in with a challenge to his leadership. This needs to be above party, petty party politics in terms of trying to oust a leader. There is no point. Every Labour member, I think, at this moment, regardless of whether you think Jeremy Corbyn can win an election or not, we have to support the leader. He's gone through 2 elections effectively because there was a leadership challenge to him, which was stupid at the time. So he's gone through that. So just forget about it. So they do need to do that, but it's going to make him wary. However, ordinarily at that point, I'd have said it's not going to happen because Jeremy Corbyn himself is just against it. He's just against it. And he will block it at every attempt. However, Momentum, which is a subgroup of Labour, very, very supportive of Jeremy Corbyn. In fact, it was basically set up, I think, to support Jeremy Corbyn. Which, you know, is... The thing about it is I'm sort of okay with a group such as that in most cases. What I'm not happy at all about, in fact, in a different light, I might well have been happy to support it. The problem is that it's very hateful. You know, if it supports people who they consider one of them, even when they're people who shouldn't be supported. And this is what's caused a lot of the anti-Semitism row in Labour. But also it attacks, nastily attacks, anyone that they don't see as part of them. So it's far too powerful a lobbying group. However, this particular group also knows that it's not being helped by Brexit, and it is considering throwing its weight behind this proposal as well. That is a very, very influential group when it comes to Jeremy Corbyn. You know. So it could well be that in a month's time, the Labour Party might, I don't know what the chances are, but it's possible that it could support another referendum. Now, you would think to yourself, well, if the government doesn't support it, they're in government. But they have such a slender lead. And you've got to remember, at the moment, you could very well be forgiven for thinking that the Conservative Party are very pro-Brexit, but they're not. It's just that the noisiest, most influential ones are. And the ones in a position of influence, such as the Prime Minister, who are not, don't feel they can publicly say that. But there's plenty of backbenchers who just don't seem to have got themselves a voice together, who would nonetheless support such a thing. So if the opposition party, which is not that much smaller than the government party, were to officially say, we are going to support Brexit, and the vast majority of the parliamentary party would anyway, so there's the odd MP that actively and publicly supports Brexit, but most don't, then all they'd need is a few backbenchers in the Conservative ranks, and they could get this through. It is possible. I don't know that we could say there's certainly no inevitability about it. I don't even know that it's likely, but it's just a possible route. Whereas at the moment, Theresa May has been saying that she will absolutely squash any attempts at a second referendum, principally because I think she's just, like Boris Johnson himself, just wanted power, and she doesn't see that she can. I don't think she believes she has the authority to wield that power. Otherwise, she would have shouted down an awful lot of people already. But yeah, she sees her only chance of survival as Prime Minister in getting the Chequers deal agreed, not only by Parliament, but by the EU. Unfortunately, that's where it's gone a bit tits up, I think, because getting a deal with the EU always came down to this. Politically, for the government to survive in this country, it has to be seen to be getting a good deal for us. But equally politically, the EU has to make it seem to others that we've got a bad deal, or at least a worse deal than if we'd stayed in the EU. Because here's the problem. If it looks like we leave, because this is why we can't simply have the Norway system as it is, even though even that would surprise many people in terms of what they have to do for it. We can't even get that simply because if we leave and we get all those benefits with few of the strings attached, then other parties in the EU would think, well, why can't we do that? And there'd be louder calls to leave, to split up. So it's politically ruinous for the EU to allow a perception that we've taken our cake and we're still going to eat it. I don't know why I keep using that phrase. I hate that phrase. It's a really stupid phrase. But anyway, so what you need to do is it's one of the classic things in politics, Politics 101, allow both sides to feel that they've got the upper hand to their public, where in reality most people don't understand what the deal involves anyway, so just, that's fine. Just let each population believe that their representatives have got the best deal for them. But unfortunately, she's mucking it right up. She's saying things like, and of course she's saying this for the purposes of domestic position at home, because she is, well, according to the papers, she's actively facing a leadership challenge. I don't know, that might be just the papers over-egging things. We'll find out in a couple of weeks, I suppose. But she's doing it for domestic support. But what she's ultimately saying is, I'm not going to back down. I'm not going to surrender to the EU. So creating that sort of, conflict again, which isn't, and that's going to be reported in European countries as well. Stupid. And then we've got the new Brexit secretary who had a chance to have a clean slate, but he's already started being again confrontational with the EU delegation. And I'm thinking, we've got no time now. Dickhead Davis, he had 2 years to sort something out nearly. New guys only had a couple of months. But, so he had to really motor with it. And he's just straight away gone with the we're not giving in attitude again, all that jingoistic nonsense. But we'll just have to see. I mean, it's one of these situations where In politics, of course, when a crucial deal like this happens, it always happens right at the last minute. Because the reality is it's usually decided weeks in advance. But because the deal might look bad in their respective countries, they always just pretend that they're still thrashing it out until the very final minute. And maybe such a deal already exists. Maybe this has all just been playing out as theatre for us, and there's been a deal agreed ages ago, and they're just doing this publicly, and on the 11th hour they'll announce, oh, we've finally got this deal, and they'll each try and make it sound great to their own public. Who knows? Hopefully that is what's going to happen. But we'll just have to wait and see on that one. So anyway, that's sort of where we are at the moment, though. If we believe the various people and what they're saying, then we have a situation where the Labour Party may support another referendum, even though Jeremy Corbyn doesn't really want one. The Conservative Party will not, even though there's a fair number in there who would support one. And even if there were another referendum, it doesn't mean that the vote would be any different, of course. All I hope is that there are, a better series of questions on it. Ask, do you want to remain in the EU? Do you want to leave the EU? But here's the thing, have a caveat. Do you want to leave the EU even if we have no deal? Or do you want to leave the EU if we can get agreement with this Chequers agreement and give basically a summary of it with the pack? And obviously, I'm not saying you split it three ways, if they're saying leave the EU with this, and this, add it all up. And just do it like that. Or you could just ask the question, do you want to leave the EU with this Chequers agreement? Don't even ask if you want to stay in the EU. If you want to leave with the Chequers agreement, or if we get no deal at all, do you still want to leave? Or if we don't get a deal at all, would you rather remain in the EU? I suppose the downside, just my final point to another referendum, why it's much preferable now that we're in this shitty situation, it is much more preferable to just to try and get a good deal, or the best we can, is because let's say we had another referendum and let's say it went the other way. But again, it was just as narrow. The margin was just as narrow. It was just a slight tweak the other way. Then there would be cause for another referendum, wouldn't there? And like David Cameron's phrase, the never-endum. But then this is why that, David Pigfucker Cameron should never have done the referendum in the first place. And he didn't have to. It was just weakness on his part. But I am going to leave it there now because I think I've rambled on enough for today. Thanks very much. If you've made it this far, thanks very much for listening. Comments down below, as I say, if you're just going to go, ooh, Ramona, grow some balls. Well, fine, you write that. That's your right. I just won't read it. Or I'll scan through it. But if you write something intelligent and I can come across it, I do try and reply where I can. Unfortunately, I do sometimes get a lot of replies. It depends. But thanks anyway. And if you do want to put your comments down, that'd be great. I would like to read them. Pros and cons. Do like if you did like it, though. Until next time, I'll see you later.